Poisoning the Well. This video is based on key insights from the book Poisoning the Well by Sharon Udasin. Introduction, Forever and Everywhere. Sharon Udasin begins by telling the story of Brenda Hampton, a woman in Cortland, Alabama, whose health problems seemed to connect to something unusual in her town's water. Brenda had been managing kidney issues and a very slow heartbeat, but after a frightening health scare, doctors suspected a link to chemicals in her drinking water. These weren't just any chemicals, they were PFAS, a group of man-made substances nicknamed forever chemicals. Udasin explains that PFAS are used to make things waterproof and stain-resistant, so they're found in everyday items like non-stick pans, raincoats, and even makeup. The problem is, these chemicals don't break down in the environment. Instead, they stay around for a very long time, building up in the water, soil, and even inside people and animals. This buildup is what makes them so dangerous. Studies have shown links between PFAS and serious health issues like certain types of cancer, problems with cholesterol, and damage to the liver and thyroid. The author highlights that while almost all Americans have some PFAS in their bodies, some communities are facing much higher levels of exposure. Udasin points out that towns near factories that make PFAS, military bases, where firefighting foam containing PFAS was used, and farms where chemical waste was spread on crops are particularly affected. It's not a fair situation, as some people are exposed to much more of these harmful chemicals than others. Udasin introduces several other individuals whose lives have been impacted by PFAS contamination, including families in Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina. These stories show how widespread the problem is, affecting people in different parts of the country and with different backgrounds. Environmental activist Erin Brockovich emphasizes just how common PFAS are, stating they're in the water we drink, the food we eat, and even the things we touch. Udasin notes that it took a long time for the government to start regulating PFAS, and even now, only a small number of the thousands of these chemicals are under control. Brockovich warns that this is a huge problem that won't disappear easily. The author concludes by emphasizing that PFAS are everywhere, lasting forever, and causing harm to both people and the planet. The narrative suggests that communities are beginning to fight back against the companies and lack of oversight that have led to this widespread contamination. Chapter 1, A Glorious Future. Sharon Udasin begins her story in rural Alabama, specifically in the towns of North Cortland and Cortland, painting a picture of a community facing a hidden crisis. Brenda Hampton, a local resident, notices a disturbing trend: a high number of illnesses, including cancers and kidney failures, among her neighbors. She recounts a heartbreaking number of deaths in just a few streets, raising serious concerns about the health of the area. The towns themselves are struggling, with businesses closing and a sense of decline settling in, a stark contrast to promises of a glorious future tied to industrial development. Udasin then takes the reader back in time to explain the origins of the problem, forever chemicals, formerly known as PFAS. She details how, in 1938, a scientist named Roy Plunkett accidentally created a new substance, Teflon, while working for DuPont. Initially intended as a replacement for dangerous refrigerants, Teflon proved to have amazing properties. It was heat-resistant, non-stick, and incredibly durable. This led to its widespread use, first in military applications like containing materials for the atomic bomb, and then in everyday products like non-stick cookware. However, the manufacturing process also created harmful byproducts. The story expands to show how these chemicals became even more prevalent with the development of a firefighting foam used by the U.S. Navy in the 1960s. This foam, also containing PFAS, was incredibly effective at extinguishing jet fuel fires. Companies like 3M became major producers of these chemicals, eventually building a large plant in Decatur, Alabama, near Cortland and North Cortland. Udasin highlights how these companies were attracted to the area because of its relaxed regulations and willingness to support industry. While the arrival of these companies initially brought jobs and economic growth, Udasin reveals a darker side. The manufacturing of PFAS created a lot of waste, and these chemicals don't break down in the environment, hence the name, Forever Chemicals. They ended up contaminating the water and soil, and Udasin suggests a link between this pollution and the health problems Brenda Hampton is witnessing in her community. The author emphasizes that the promise of a thriving future for these towns didn't materialize as expected, with businesses closing and the area falling into decline. Udasin connects the historical narrative to Brenda Hampton's personal story. Brenda herself developed kidney problems after returning to Cortland, leading her to suspect a connection between her health and the environment. She began documenting illnesses in her community, finding a shockingly high number of cases. Despite facing skepticism from some neighbors, Brenda dedicates herself to helping those in need, providing essential supplies and transportation to medical appointments. The chapter concludes by contrasting the initial optimism surrounding industrial development with the current reality of environmental contamination and health concerns. Udasin points out the irony of a town once touted as having a glorious future, now grappling with the consequences of unchecked industrial practices and the lasting impact of forever chemicals. The legacy of slavery and segregation in the area is also briefly touched upon, adding another layer of complexity to the story of a community struggling with its past and present. Chapter 2, A Very Toxic Compound. Sharon Udasin details a troubling history of how companies knew about the dangers of PFAS, often called forever chemicals, for decades, yet continued production and downplayed the risks to the public. As 3M and DuPont ramped up production of these chemicals, used in products like Teflon in the mid-20th century, early signs emerged of health problems. Workers exposed to heated Teflon experienced flu-like symptoms, and studies showed PFAS could stick to human blood and even cause tumors in rats. Despite these warnings, companies like DuPont actively worked to discredit concerns, linking symptoms to things like soot instead of the chemicals themselves. The story reveals a pattern of internal awareness of harm, alongside public reassurance. DuPont scientists discovered PFAS could damage organs in animals, with one compound labeled a very toxic compound, requiring extreme caution. Yet, simultaneously, the company published pamphlets dismissing health risks and even advised employees on how to handle rumors. The FDA initially showed little interest, and even when presented with evidence of potential cancer risks, responses were slow and dismissive. This lack of regulation allowed the problem to grow. Early research showed PFAS didn't just cause temporary illness. Scientists found the chemicals in blood samples and linked them to organ damage in animals. However, companies continued to prioritize production over safety. Even when the FDA raised concerns about PFAS leaching into food, DuPont managed to navigate the regulations and continue selling products. This highlights how powerful companies could influence regulatory decisions. As evidence mounted, 3M and DuPont began internal investigations, finding PFAS in their workers' blood and even in the blood of people in distant locations like a Chinese village. They also discovered links to birth defects and increased cancer risks. Despite these findings, the companies often downplayed the dangers to regulators and the public, sometimes even moving female employees away from potential exposure without fully acknowledging the risks. The narrative shows a clear conflict between corporate interests and public health. Internal memos reveal discussions about legal and ethical positions and strategies to manage potential lawsuits. One memo even suggested charging contractors for PFAS testing to avoid financial responsibility. While the EPA eventually took action, phasing out some PFAS in 2000, the damage was already done. The story culminates with evidence of ongoing pollution of the Tennessee River near 3M and Dakin plants. Despite knowing about the risks, these companies continued to discharge PFAS into the environment, sometimes even misreporting the amounts. Local communities downstream, relying on the river for their water supply, were unknowingly exposed to these harmful chemicals. The author, Udasin, emphasizes that this isn't just a historical issue, but a continuing problem with lasting consequences for both human health and the environment. Chapter 3: So Many Ailments. Brenda Hampton became a champion for her community when she discovered that harmful, forever chemicals, also known as PFAS, were making people sick in Cortland, Alabama. She quickly started a center to help her neighbors, even paying for supplies herself. It wasn't long before she connected with Lamont Dupree, who was amazed by Brenda's dedication to uncovering the extent of the problem and how it was impacting people's health. Brenda kept discovering more and more families affected, noticing a pattern of illnesses and unusual cancers. The story highlights how PFAS contamination isn't just about numbers in the water. It's about real people facing heartbreaking consequences. Katronica Jones, for example, tragically lost her daughter at birth and firmly believes the chemicals played a role. While it's hard to prove a direct link, the pain of losing a child and the knowledge of the surrounding pollution created a strong conviction for Katronica. These stories were repeated throughout the area, showing a disturbing trend. Brenda's work led her to meet Howard Buster Branham, a veteran and cancer patient. Buster admired Brenda's courage and willingness to challenge those responsible for the pollution. He had been an activist in the past and recognized her determination. Sadly, Buster passed away from his cancer in 2024, another loss that fueled Brenda's fight. These personal connections drove Brenda to confront the companies and officials she believed were responsible. The contamination wasn't limited to drinking water. It extended to the land, with farms using sludge, a byproduct of wastewater treatment, as fertilizer. While this sludge can help crops grow, it also contains toxic chemicals, including PFAS, which then run off into the Tennessee River. This river is a source of recreation and wildlife, but it's also a pathway for the chemicals to spread. The TVA dam upstream worsened the problem by reducing water flow, concentrating the pollutants. People like Ronald Mixon, a former diver, experienced health problems he linked to the river's contamination. He and his fellow divers faced a high rate of cancer, with Ronald being the only survivor. Despite the risks, some residents continued to fish in the river, unaware of the dangers or unwilling to give up a tradition. Legal action brought some relief. A lawsuit against 3M resulted in a $35 million settlement, which funded a new water treatment plant for the area. However, not all communities benefited immediately, and the fight for clean water continues. Brenda's dedication, as described by Udasin, has inspired others and brought attention to the widespread problem of PFAS contamination. She faces threats and opposition, but remains committed to holding polluters accountable and protecting the health of her community. Her ultimate goal is to force the state to revoke permits allowing the release of these harmful chemicals, believing that financial settlements aren't enough when people's lives are at stake. Brenda's story shows how one person's determination can make a difference in the face of a complex environmental and health crisis. Chapter 4: All Settled. Sharon Udasin details how a town called Decatur, Alabama, unknowingly built its community on a hidden danger: a landfill filled with harmful chemicals called PFAS, often referred to as forever chemicals. These chemicals don't break down in the environment and can cause health problems. The story begins with Pat Underwood, a local resident who fondly remembers growing up near Brookhaven Middle School in the 1990s, a school everyone knew was built on old trash. They even joked it was slowly sinking. But the real problem wasn't just the trash, it was what was in the trash. For years, 3M, a large company, had been dumping waste at this landfill, including PFAS. These chemicals ended up contaminating the land and eventually the water. While officials monitored the site for a while, testing eventually stopped. Later, rumors began swirling that the school was heavily polluted with PFAS. Attorney Carl Cole discovered the landfill's history while at his son's baseball game, learning from an older resident that the field itself was built on the old dump site. This led to a $35 million settlement with the local water authority, but the problem was far from solved. The city and school officials were eager to deal with the problem, but Cole believed they were too trusting of 3M, suspecting the company had influence over local leaders. In 2020, 3M bought the land for a price much higher than its actual value and began demolition, claiming to recycle most of the building. However, tests showed significant levels of PFAS remained in the soil. Despite this, officials stated the levels were safe for a new green space. Udasin highlights how 3M also quietly purchased other contaminated properties through a shell company, Woodtrill Estates, LLC, whose address led directly back to 3M headquarters. This happened after a local group, Tennessee Riverkeeper, discovered PFAS contamination in a nearby stream. The company bought land intended for a new neighborhood, but development stalled, with only a few homes built. This raised concerns that 3M was buying up polluted land to control the situation, potentially reselling it later when people forgot about the contamination. Former City Council President Paige Bibby and Councilman Charles Kirby fought for transparency and accountability. They discovered that city officials were secretly negotiating with 3M and other companies responsible for the pollution, and were even working to prevent them from being re-elected. Bibby recounted being threatened and facing suspicious incidents, like her tires being slashed. They believed the city was prioritizing a quick settlement and a new recreation center over truly cleaning up the contamination and protecting public health. The eventual $100 million settlement with 3M was criticized for allocating too much money to projects like the recreation center and not enough to cleaning up the water and land. Udasin notes that Decatur doesn't even collect property taxes from 3M because the plant is located in an unincorporated area. Despite assurances from officials, residents like Pat Underwood remain wary of the water quality and worry about the long-term health effects of PFAS exposure. Udasin concludes by emphasizing the deep connection residents like Bibby and Underwood have to Decatur, despite its problems. They are determined to fight for a healthier future, even as they acknowledge the challenges of overcoming corruption and the lasting legacy of forever chemicals in their community. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of industrial pollution and the importance of holding companies accountable for protecting both our health and the environment. Chapter 5: Miracle Foam. The story begins with a surprising connection to Senator John McCain, whose life was saved during a 1967 shipboard fire. Ironically, the very foam used to fight such fires, a miracle foam called AFFF, would later become a source of a different kind of danger. Sharon Udasin details how this foam, designed to quickly extinguish jet fuel fires, contained chemicals known as PFAS, often called forever chemicals, because they don't break down in the environment. The military quickly adopted AFFF, and it became widespread not just on naval vessels, but also at airports and military bases across the country. Bases used it not only during emergencies, but also in training exercises, intentionally setting fires to practice putting them out. For the manufacturers, like 3M and Tyco, it was a profitable product. However, Udasin reveals that even as the foam was being hailed as a lifesaver, concerns about its toxicity were beginning to surface. The narrative then shifts to Colorado Springs, Colorado, a city heavily influenced by its proximity to several military installations. Mark Favors, a veteran himself, recounts a troubling pattern of illness within his large, patriotic family. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents were increasingly diagnosed with cancer and kidney disease. He noticed a connection between these illnesses and their proximity to military bases, particularly after his grandmother moved to Widefield, near Peterson Space Force Base. Udasin highlights how the Favors family story isn't unique. The area around Colorado Springs had a long history of military service, but it also seemed to have a growing health crisis. Mark's research led him to discover that Widefield's water supply was contaminated with PFAS at levels exceeding safety guidelines. The military had been using AFFF for decades, and the chemicals were leaching into the groundwater, ultimately affecting the community's drinking water. even though warnings about AFFF's potential dangers emerged as early as the 1970s, the military continued to use it. Internal reports flagged the foam as a pollutant and suggested limiting its use, but it remained a standard firefighting tool. Udasin points out that 3M itself acknowledged the foam's persistence in the environment, and the Navy even considered it a potential hazardous waste. Despite this knowledge, the use of AFFF continued for years. The consequences were significant. Families like the Favors experienced a heartbreaking number of illnesses, and the contamination spread beyond military installations, impacting nearby communities. The military eventually began to phase out AFFF, but the damage was already done. The EPA revised its health advisories, acknowledging the dangers of PFAS at much lower levels, prompting widespread testing and cleanup efforts. Udasin details how the military is now working to address the contamination, but the process is slow and complex. While some bases have implemented treatment systems to remove PFAS from the water, the chemicals are incredibly persistent and widespread. The author emphasizes that the story of AFFF and PFAS is a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of prioritizing convenience and cost over environmental and public health. It's a story of a miracle foam that left a lasting and harmful legacy. Chapter 6, Boots on the Ground. The chapter focuses on the real-life impact of PFAS, often called forever chemicals, on families and communities, particularly those near military bases. Sharon Udasin details how these chemicals, used in products like firefighting foam, have seeped into the water supply and potentially caused serious health problems for people who serve their country and their families. Mark Favors and his relatives grapple with the possibility that their illnesses, including cancer and autoimmune diseases, are linked to PFAS exposure. The story centers on Steve Patterson, a military veteran, and his sister Princess, who grew up in a highly contaminated area of Colorado Springs. Princess began experiencing health issues as a teenager, eventually being diagnosed with lupus and later bladder cancer. Her son, Yazid, was born with one kidney and also experienced health problems. The family continued to drink the contaminated water even as Princess's health declined, highlighting the lack of awareness and the widespread nature of the problem. Steve even donated a kidney to his sister, later wondering if he unknowingly gave her an organ affected by the chemicals. Udasin explains that the military's initial attempts to address the contamination haven't fully resolved the concerns of affected families. The chapter introduces the story of Wilbur Tennant, a West Virginia farmer who discovered his cattle were sick due to chemicals released by DuPont, a major manufacturer of Teflon. Tennant's lawsuit, aided by lawyer Rob Bilott, revealed that DuPont knew about the dangers of PFOA for decades, but kept it secret. This case became a landmark in the fight against PFAS contamination. The author details how Mark Favors brought his family's story to Congress, testifying before a House committee and urging a thorough investigation into the issue. He felt frustrated that the Department of Defense was in charge of investigating itself, believing an independent body was needed. Udasin highlights the work of advocates like Liz Rosenbaum, who dedicated herself to raising awareness and fighting for clean water in her community. Rosenbaum's own health struggles, along with her husband's, further emphasized the personal toll of PFAS exposure. Udasin explains that PFAS chemicals are tricky because they don't break down easily in the body and can interfere with normal processes. Scientists have discovered that PFAS clings to proteins, disrupting how the body works. The Colorado Study on Community Outcomes from PFAS Exposure, COSCOPE, is underway, trying to understand the full extent of the health effects in El Paso County. Liz Rosenbaum's blood test results showed very high levels of PFHXS, a type of PFAS, demonstrating the widespread exposure in the area. The chapter concludes with a sense of resilience within the Favors-Patterson family, who continue to support each other despite facing ongoing health challenges and loss, comparing their tight-knit bond to a pod of orcas, strong, protective, and determined. Chapter 7, Unqualified Immunity. Sharon Udasin details how Liz Rosenbaum's personal health struggles fueled her fight against PFAS contamination in her Colorado community. In 2016, local water districts discovered their water was polluted, and initially, leaders didn't fully understand the problem. However, Liz's efforts, along with legislator Tony Exum, led to Colorado's first PFAS law in 2019. This law restricted the use of firefighting foams containing PFAS, as these foams had polluted the drinking water of nearly 100,000 people near Peterson Space Force Base. The law recognized cleaning up the contamination would take a long time and pointed out that safer firefighting foams already existed, like those used at London's Heathrow Airport. Udasin explains that Colorado didn't stop there. The state added more restrictions and set its own limits for PFAS in water, similar to guidelines from the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. They also began banning PFAS from everyday products like rugs, cosmetics, and food packaging, with more items to be added by 2028. Other states like Maine, Minnesota, and Washington are also taking similar steps to protect people from these chemicals. These forever chemicals are called that because they don't break down in the environment or our bodies. Liz Rosenbaum's fight continued when she moved to Wigwam and discovered its water supply was also contaminated with PFAS. Levels were below older EPA guidelines but exceeded newer, stricter limits set in 2024. Scientists emphasize that different types of PFAS often appear together, making it hard to study their individual effects. Testing revealed multiple types of PFAS in Wigwam, including PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS, with high concentrations found at nearby military bases like Fort Carson and Peterson. The military initially dismissed Peterson as the source, citing elevation differences, but acknowledged other bases used the same firefighting foam. A report showed PFAS contamination in wells near Fort Carson, potentially linking it to the problem in Wigwam. While officials work on long-term solutions, Liz helped secure emergency funding for water filters for her community, recognizing they couldn't wait years for a permanent fix. Udasin highlights the personal toll of PFAS contamination through the story of Liz's friend, Molly Miller, who battled cancer for years. Molly's journey began with a small lump in 2011 and progressed through multiple treatments, including a double mastectomy. Despite initial improvements, the cancer returned and became more aggressive, eventually leading to her death in 2022. Molly remained focused on fighting for justice, even as her health declined, and she passed on her detailed PFAS files to Liz as a final gift. Liz continues her activism, even running for a seat in the Colorado General Assembly, though she wasn't elected. She expresses her commitment through colorful tattoos that symbolize her fight. Meanwhile, Liz's partner, Mark Favors, continues to push for a congressional investigation into the PFAS issue, believing it's essential to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. He's frustrated by legal barriers, like statutes of limitations, that prevent families of those affected from seeking justice. Udasin details the complexities of legal action against the military, explaining the concept of discretionary function immunity, which protects government employees in certain situations. However, recent legal developments suggest potential avenues for lawsuits, particularly regarding improper disposal of AFFF. A major legal battle is unfolding through multi-district litigation, MDL, where thousands of cases against PFAS manufacturers are being consolidated. Settlements have been reached with DuPont, Chemours, and Corteva for over $1 billion for water providers, and 3M for between $10.5 and $12.5 billion. The author notes that while these settlements are a step forward, the fight for justice is far from over, especially for individuals suffering from PFAS-related illnesses. Determining a direct link between PFAS exposure and specific health problems remains challenging, but advancements in science are expanding the list of conditions potentially linked to these chemicals. Napoli, a lawyer involved in the MDL, believes the legal battles will continue for years. involving manufacturers, distributors, and potentially wastewater treatment facilities. Udasin concludes by emphasizing that El Paso County, Colorado, was one of the first areas to raise concerns about PFAS contamination, highlighting its role in bringing attention to this widespread environmental and health crisis. Chapter 8, A Win-Win. Sharon Udasin presents a troubling picture of how forever chemicals, known as PFAS, are impacting lives and landscapes in Maine. The chapter centers on the Higginses, a retired couple who unknowingly built their dream, an alpaca farm on land contaminated by these pollutants. They discovered their well water was unsafe after a neighbor alerted them to state testing, revealing PFAS levels that demanded they stop using the water for anything. This contamination isn't just an inconvenience. It threatens their livelihood and future plans as the value of their property has plummeted. The Higginses' story highlights a common, unsettling reality. Many people are unaware they're being exposed to these harmful chemicals. The source of the problem, Udasin explains, is the widespread practice of spreading treated sewage sludge, the leftover solids from wastewater treatment, on farmland. This was seen as a win-win, a cheap way for towns to get rid of waste and a free fertilizer for farmers. However, paper mills in Maine, which often use PFAS in their processes, contribute significantly to the contamination in the sludge. While treatment removes some waste, it doesn't eliminate PFAS, allowing these chemicals to seep into the soil and water. The practice was encouraged by the state for decades, partly due to limited landfill space. Now, Maine is grappling with over 1,000 potentially contaminated sites. Udasin details how this practice has affected Fred Stone, a multi-generational farmer. Stone initially participated in the sludge spreading program, believing he was helping his land. He followed state guidelines, but later discovered his farm was heavily contaminated. His dairy operation was shut down, his cows suffered health problems, and his family's legacy is now threatened. Stone's story is particularly poignant because he holds himself responsible, yet also points to a system that allowed this contamination to happen. He emphasizes the state's initial approval of the practice, citing a permit that claimed the sludge wouldn't harm the environment. The health consequences are deeply concerning. Both the Higginses and the Stones have alarmingly high levels of PFAS in their blood. Scientists are finding links between PFAS exposure and health issues like high blood pressure and high cholesterol, though proving a direct connection is difficult. Beyond human health, the contamination impacts animals too, with concerns about the alpacas on the Higginses farm and the cows on Stones. The chapter also touches on the potential for PFAS to accumulate in food, citing studies showing the chemicals can be absorbed by crops like carrots and lettuce. Udasin introduces Adam Nordell and Johanna Davis, organic farmers whose farm was also contaminated by sludge. Their story illustrates the devastating impact on smaller, newer farms. They were forced to sell their land to Maine Farmland Trust, highlighting the economic hardship caused by PFAS contamination. Nordell places blame on both the manufacturers of PFAS and the policy of using contaminated sludge as fertilizer, calling it insane. He also praises Stone for bringing attention to the issue. The chapter concludes with a sense of urgency and frustration. While the EPA is beginning to address the problem, many feel the response is too slow. Lawsuits are being filed, and farmers are left to deal with the consequences of a decades-long practice that was once considered beneficial. Udasin's reporting reveals a complex web of responsibility, highlighting the need for stricter regulations, better testing, and a commitment to protecting both public health and the environment from these persistent and dangerous, forever chemicals. Chapter 9, First in the Nation. Fred Stone, a Maine farmer, unexpectedly became a key figure in fighting against PFAS, often called forever chemicals, after discovering they had contaminated his land. He found himself working with activists and lawmakers, even though he didn't consider himself an environmentalist. Stone believed that protecting public health shouldn't be a political issue, but he also made it clear he supported Mike Pence, showing his complex views. His neighbor, State Senator Henry Ingwersen, acknowledged Stone's courage in speaking out, highlighting how his actions brought people together across political lines. Maine quickly became a leader in addressing PFAS contamination. Lawmakers passed several laws, starting with the Safe Food Packaging Act in 2019, which aimed to ban PFAS in products but waited for safer alternatives to be found. They also extended the time people had to sue companies responsible for PFAS pollution and set limits for PFAS in drinking water. By 2021, Maine had gone even further, becoming the first state to ban intentionally added PFAS in products, with a full ban planned by 2030, and also stopped using firefighting foams containing these chemicals. Governor Janet Mills created a $60 million fund to buy farmland contaminated with PFAS, helping farmers like Fred Stone. However, not everyone qualified for the fund. Lawrence and Penny Higgins, alpaca farmers, were disappointed to learn their business didn't meet the requirements. The state focused on buying commercial farms, leaving others struggling with the consequences of PFAS. Despite these challenges, Fred Stone felt Maine had made good progress, with PFAS discussions largely avoiding intense political battles. While Stone appreciated the fund, he wasn't eager to sell his historic farm. He'd already had to sell over 100 cows due to the financial strain, and now relied on state grants to feed his remaining animals. He explored options like selling show calves or starting a small ice cream business, but the future of the farm remained uncertain. Stone's ideal solution was a conservation easement, allowing him to keep the land but stop producing food, receiving payment from the state in return. However, the state only offered buyouts. The story expands beyond Fred Stone's farm to show the wider impact of PFAS. Dan Kusniers, from the Penobscot Nation, recalled learning about PFAS after Fred Stone's case became public. The tribe's history with pollution from paper mills made them particularly concerned. PFAS had contaminated the Penobscot River, affecting fish that are a vital part of the tribe's diet and culture. Research showed high levels of PFAS in fish, especially American shad, posing health risks to those who consume them regularly. The source of the PFAS in the river was traced back to the Juniper Ridge landfill, which accepted waste from paper mills like Nine Dragons. While the landfill claimed to manage the chemicals safely, Kusniers worried about the wastewater being treated at the mill and released back into the river. Testing revealed high levels of PFAS in the landfill's leachate, the liquid that drains from waste. Nate Saunders, a state employee, discovered his own well water was heavily contaminated with PFAS, likely from sludge spread on nearby fields. He connected his wife's past kidney problems to the contamination and filed a lawsuit against Huhtamaki, a paper company. Saunders' story highlighted the widespread nature of PFAS pollution and the long-term health risks it poses. Udasin notes that while new federal regulations require monitoring of PFAS in public water systems, many people in Maine rely on private wells, leaving them responsible for testing their own water. She also pointed out a gap in federal reporting, making it difficult to track PFAS releases nationwide. The chapter, as told by Sharon Udasin, illustrates how PFAS contamination is a complex problem affecting communities, the environment, and public health, and how Maine is attempting to lead the way in finding solutions. Chapter 10, A Premature Victory Dance. Sharon Udasin details a frustrating history of how long it took to acknowledge the dangers of PFAS, often called forever chemicals, and how they impact people and the planet. For years, the government didn't fully oversee these chemicals, even though they were showing up in people's bodies and the environment. This was partly because older chemicals were automatically considered safe, and partly because industries fought against stricter rules. People like Nate Saunders in Maine, Mark Favors in Colorado, and Brenda Hampton in Alabama are examples of individuals facing health problems potentially linked to PFAS exposure, and they're left to fight for answers and protection. The story really begins to unfold in 1998 when 3M, a major manufacturer, discovered PFAS in almost every blood sample they tested, even samples from places where the chemical wasn't known to be used. This shocking finding prompted 3M to alert the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. But even then, the response was slow. It turned out 3M had raised concerns before, in the 1980s, linking PFOA to birth defects in rats, but the EPA's investigation at the time downplayed the risk, suggesting the issue was a mistake in how the research was done. Despite these early warnings, progress was slow. The EPA started to sound the alarm, especially about two common PFAS chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, and even convinced 3M to stop making them. However, this didn't solve the problem. The chemicals were already widespread, and companies continued to use existing stockpiles. The EPA also tried a collaborative approach, working with 8 chemical companies in a stewardship program to reduce emissions. While the program reported success, it relied on voluntary participation and didn't address the existing contamination. Udasin highlights a troubling pattern of industry influence and government hesitation. During the George W. Bush administration, there was a close relationship with DuPont, even as concerns about PFAS grew. Later, under the Obama administration, some EPA staff reported being told to slow down PFAS research. Even when the EPA made progress, like lowering the acceptable levels of PFAS in drinking water, it felt like a step forward followed by a step back. The Trump administration further complicated matters. Udasin details how political appointees seemed to prioritize industry interests, delaying crucial regulations and even interfering with scientific assessments. For example, the EPA was slow to designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances, which would have made it easier to clean up contaminated sites. They also weakened safety reviews for new PFAS chemicals, allowing more potentially harmful substances to enter the market. Finally, under the Biden administration, the EPA began to take more decisive action. They closed loopholes that allowed companies to avoid reporting PFAS releases, proposed national limits for PFAS in drinking water, and officially designated PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. However, Udasin emphasizes that much work remains. The legacy of decades of inaction means widespread contamination and ongoing health risks. While the Biden administration's efforts are a positive step, the long-term impact will depend on continued vigilance and a commitment to protecting public health and the environment. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the challenges of regulating toxic chemicals and the importance of prioritizing public safety over industry profits. Chapter 11, The Next Generation. The year 2017 began like any other for Emily Donovan, until a newspaper article warned about a harmful chemical in the drinking water of Wilmington, North Carolina. Emily, living nearby, immediately wondered if her family was also at risk. It turned out they were. A new type of forever chemical called Gen X was showing up in the water supply, and it was supposed to be safer than older chemicals, but concerns were growing. Emily worried about her children, who had always drunk plenty of water, and wondered if her husband's brain tumor could be connected. Finding information about Gen X was difficult, as most research focused on the older chemicals. The story of Gen X's discovery was a bit accidental. Reporter Vaughn Haggerty stumbled upon information about the chemical while researching other pollutants in North Carolina waterways. He learned that Gen X was being released from a chemical plant into the Cape Fear River, which provided drinking water for many communities. While the EPA had previously found Gen X in Wilmington's water, this information hadn't reached the public. At the time, very little was known about Gen X, but it was being used as a replacement for older, more dangerous chemicals. Jessica Cannon, a former doctor, became involved after the election of Donald Trump, starting a local group to advocate for political change. When Haggerty's article came out, Jessica's group was ready to act. She, Emily Donovan, and local politician Harper Peterson Jr. quickly formed Clean Cape Fear to inform people about Gen X and seek accountability from the chemical's manufacturer, Chemours. The group's formation highlighted the growing public concern about the health risks associated with these chemicals. The situation with Gen-X was linked to a pattern of behavior by DuPont, the original manufacturer of the older chemicals like PFOA. Around 2012, as concerns about PFOA grew, DuPont decided to create a new company, Chemours, and transfer its PFAS business, and the legal responsibility for the pollution, to it. Experts like David Larker explained that this was a way for DuPont to protect itself legally and financially. This move raised questions about whether companies should be allowed to simply pass off environmental problems to new entities. DuPont's strategy involved spinning off Chemours in 2015, estimating the new company would face around $291 million in legal costs related to PFOA. However, the actual costs ended up being much higher. The company then merged with Dow, creating Dow DuPont, before splitting again into 3 separate companies. DuPont maintained that it was no longer the same company responsible for the original pollution, a claim that many found frustrating. Chemours also faced lawsuits, alleging that DuPont had intentionally created it to absorb environmental liabilities. The legal battles were complex, with Chemours suing Dow DuPont, claiming DuPont had underestimated the potential costs and unfairly burdened Chemours with a disproportionate share of the environmental problems. While some cases were dismissed or settled, the core issue remained: who was responsible for cleaning up the contamination and compensating those who had been harmed. Experts like Mark Garvey pointed out that the corporate restructuring made it difficult to trace responsibility back to the original decisions made decades ago. Meanwhile, people in Wilmington were experiencing health problems. Emily Donovan's husband developed a brain tumor, and she wondered if it was linked to the contaminated water. Chris Meek, a teacher, discovered he had kidney cancer after a gallbladder rupture and believed the water was the cause. Sadly, Amy Shands, a speech pathologist, lost her battle with cancer after years of drinking the water. Her husband, Jonathan, believes the contamination played a role in her illness and wants those responsible held accountable. Chemours initially claimed the levels of Gen-X in the water were safe, but the EPA later suggested that Gen-X might be linked to cancer. The company also argued that the Gen-X released into the river was a byproduct of another process and wasn't intentionally discharged. However, officials questioned this claim, pointing out that the byproduct was still a pollutant. The story of Gen-X in North Carolina revealed a pattern of companies prioritizing profits over public health and the environment, and highlighted the challenges of holding them accountable. Udasin details how the initial contamination with PFOA in 2002 was largely ignored by state regulators, setting the stage for the Gen-X crisis years later. Chapter 12, Whac-A-Mole. Sharon Udasin details a frustrating battle against forever chemicals, specifically PFAS, in and around Wilmington, North Carolina. The story begins with Emily Donovan's worry about her children's exposure to these chemicals in their school water after news broke in 2017. Donovan's group asked the local water provider, H2GO, to install filters, and H2GO agreed, believing it was the right thing to do for the kids. However, the county government refused the donation, arguing it wasn't fair to only filter water at a few schools. This meant children continued drinking potentially contaminated water for 3 more years than necessary, a delay Donovan found deeply upsetting. The chapter highlights a recurring theme, identifying one PFAS problem only to discover another. The Cape Fear Public Utility Authority, CFPUA, upgraded its water treatment plant in 2012, hoping it would handle new contaminants like Gen-X, which was detected in 2016. Unfortunately, the new system didn't work very well. CFPUA then implemented temporary fixes, filtering out some Gen-X and providing bottled water, eventually installing more effective carbon filters. However, even these filters aren't perfect. New, shorter-chain PFAS chemicals, like PFMOAA and PFPRA, are now slipping through, presenting a new challenge. It's like playing Whac-A-Mole, fix one problem, and another pops up. Udasin illustrates how companies like Chemours have contributed to the problem. CFPUA is suing Chemours and DuPont to recover the costs of cleaning up the water, arguing that these companies polluted the river for decades. Chemours even proposed expanding its production, raising concerns among activists like Donovan, who believe the company can't be trusted. The author points out that while Chemours claims to be reducing emissions, new, potentially harmful chemicals are still appearing in the water supply. The impact on communities, particularly Rock Hill, a predominantly Black neighborhood, is deeply concerning. Residents there rely on private wells, and many weren't aware of the contamination. Stories of numerous cancer diagnoses within a small area are heartbreaking. Betty Newkirk recounted 9 neighbors dying of cancer, and by May 2024, that number had grown to over 130. The community has faced long-standing issues getting access to public water and sewer systems, and the PFAS crisis adds another layer of injustice. Udasin emphasizes the lack of clear information and the slow response from authorities. Ann Trout discovered contamination in her new home and was frustrated that her realtor hadn't disclosed it. Janice Gaines, a community leader in Rock Hill, described feeling like she had let people down because it took so long for the community to mobilize and demand action. Even when testing is done, interpreting the results and understanding the health risks is complex. Scientists are still learning about the effects of these newer PFAS chemicals, like PFMOAA and PFPRA, and the long-term consequences remain unknown. Through the narrative, Udasin shows how the fight against PFAS is ongoing and multifaceted. While some progress is being made, like Brunswick County installing a reverse osmosis plant and New Hanover County funding connections to public water for some Rock Hill residents, the problem is far from solved. The author concludes by highlighting the need for continued research, stronger regulations, and accountability from the companies responsible for the pollution. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of forever chemicals and the importance of protecting our water supply. Chapter 13, The Real Fix. Sharon Udasin details the complicated fight against PFAS, often called forever chemicals, and how they're impacting both our bodies and the world around us. Scientists are realizing there aren't just a few types of these chemicals, but thousands. This makes finding solutions really tricky, because we don't even fully understand what's out there and how it's changing in the environment. Early efforts to clean up contamination were stalled when researchers realized they didn't know what they were cleaning up in the first place, especially in firefighting foam used by the military. New research shows that many PFAS break down into other PFAS, making the problem even bigger than originally thought. A major concern is the rise of ultra-short-chain PFAS. These tiny chemicals are so small they can slip right through many water filters, showing up in places like Wilmington, North Carolina's water supply. Studies are finding these ultra-short chains in the blood of most people tested, and they now make up a large percentage of the PFAS in our bodies. Scientists are urgently trying to figure out where these are coming from and what they're doing to our health. The effects of PFAS are proving to be widespread. They aren't just affecting one organ, but many: the brain, heart, liver, immune system, and more. It's becoming clear that if someone has a health problem, PFAS exposure could be a contributing factor. Researchers are now focusing on finding biomarkers, or early warning signs in the body, that can show PFAS are causing harm before a full-blown disease develops. They're even using mini organs grown in labs to study how PFAS affect our bodies at a cellular level. For example, studies are showing a clear link between PFAS and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and scientists are investigating if combining PFAS exposure with alcohol makes the problem worse. Scientists are working hard to identify all the different types of PFAS, using powerful tools like mass spectrometry. They're also developing ways to destroy these chemicals, not just remove them. Current cleanup methods often just move the PFAS from one place to another, like from water to a landfill. Several promising technologies are emerging, including electrochemical oxidation, which uses electricity to break down PFAS, and a process using supercritical water that can destroy the chemicals completely. However, even with these advances, the problem is huge. PFAS are in so many products, cookware, clothing, cosmetics, that completely eliminating exposure is incredibly difficult. Experts agree that stopping the production of new PFAS and stricter regulations are crucial. Ultimately, understanding the long-term effects of PFAS will require following people over many years, a massive undertaking. Communities impacted by PFAS are becoming more involved, demanding solutions and advocating for change. People like Liz Rosenbaum, who has documented her fight against PFAS with tattoos, are determined to keep pushing for justice and a cleaner future. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.